Friends, hey, hi, what's up? How are you? This is leowt here, coming at you with a special episode of Conversations that is simultaneously a mashup with one of my homework assignments from graduate school. So, for those of you who are Conversations listeners and don't know, I'm going to graduate school currently studying for a Master's of Arts in Religious Studies with a concentration in interreligious studies with an eye on a PhD in queer theology. And for those of you who are classmates of mine and don't know what Conversations is a podcast that I run. I created conversations around the idea of coming together regularly and intentionally to have spiritually minded conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. The only and chief, highest, utmost concern of conversations that everybody's voice is welcome at the table. So I am mashing together conversations and my graduate school studies in this because I talk about both with the other. So we're doing this together today. But what I decided to cover for you today is two articles that I'm reading for school. Both of them are by the same person, so I'm going to talk about both of them in this video, but I'm going to break them up a little bit, okay? So the first, the articles in this case are written by Scott Haldeman. He is an associate professor of worship at Chicago Theological Seminary. He holds a Master's of Divinity and PhD from Union Theological Seminary, which, funny story, was the first seminary I ever really thought I was going to go to. I walked in and there was like a queer student union at the seminary, and I was like, because at that point I didn't know the two things could coexist. So, at any rate, Professor Haldeman's he specializes in the history, theology, and practice of US Protestant worship, which informs his writings on the interplay of theology and queer identity in these two articles. The first article is A Queer Fidelity, Reinventing Christian Marriage, and the second article is Receptivity and Revelation, a Spirituality of Gay Male Sex. So, I'm actually going to talk about the receptivity and revelation piece first, and then I'm going to move into the fidelity one. So, in receptivity and revelation, Professor Haldeman, he translates his distinct queer perspective from the institution of the act of gay male sex to reflections on his sense of theology and spirituality, which is really interesting because he explicitly says at the beginning, I am speaking about the particular act of being a bottom, being a receptive partner in a gay male sex act, and I'm not speaking of anyone else who would occupy that position in any other relational arrangement. So he's situating himself firmly within a queer experience, not purporting to speak for anybody else, be it a cisgender, transgender, heterosexual, queer, polyamorous, no other relational arrangement, just his, which I thought was a good point of delineation because, as he points out in the article, I'm trying to remember who the person was, but as he points out in the article, some people, there's a prominent womanist writer who views penetration as an act of colonization. And so he was really careful to parse out that this is his thoughts about theology that connect to his experience as a receptive partner in gay male sex. He parsed out 4 points throughout the article, which I thought were really interesting. I'm going to read them in reverse order of the way they are in the article because the first one to me was the most salient. So I want to explain the others and then I'll talk a little bit more about the fourth. So one of the things that Professor Haldeman says that he learned from being a receptive partner in a gay male sex act is the idea of communion. His quote from the paper says, queer love, despised and supposedly unproductive, is in fact often gratuitous and extravagant, like the love of God in creation and redemption. So he said that as he's experiencing this sex act with his partner, he's learning more about the idea of communion with God and the extravagant and overwhelming and abundant love that God has and that he experiences as a person of faith. And he's learning that through the metaphor of having sex with his partner, which I think is really interesting because as a person like myself, I'm demisexual, so I experience sexual attraction via the avenue of pre-existing relationship with a person. I'm not a person that's prone to prefer to have sex with somebody apart from a relationship. I need a relationship to feel that attraction. And I think it's really interesting that he's talking about sort of consummating this relationship, or taking this relationship to the next level and experiencing a deeper sense of communion within that. Because that's something that my experience as a demisexual person definitely would be informed by and would inform my faith, is my relationship with divinity. And the more I build that relationship, the more the sense of communion builds, and the more connection builds, and the more powerful the interaction is. So that's definitely something that resonated with me. The next facet, let's say, of his being a receptive partner in this gay male sex act, that he felt drew a parallel for him between his spirituality and the experience, was the idea of emptying and being filled. And that is a very literal function, right? When you're engaged in this same-sex sex activity. But I think it's really important because the Bible does use a lot of metaphors for emptying and being filled. So there's sort of a palpable realization of this that he's experiencing in this moment of connection with another human being. He also made sure to delineate that he said, "I do not and cannot forget that God is not my male lover, doesn't literally seduce me, and also delights in others who find their pleasure and affirmation in different acts, bodily-based analogies, and relational metaphors." So in this way, Professor Haldeman is acknowledging that he is experiencing a connection to divinity, and he is simultaneously being filled physically and emotionally at the same time, and he's recognizing that that's his experience, but he's not confining that emptying and being filled to someone else having to have that same experience, to have that feeling, especially when it comes to religiously speaking, which I think is important because so many people will confine their experience of religiosity, their understanding of divinity, they'll confine it to their context. That's something that, ironically, we see a lot in the realm of church that Professor Haldeman studies regarding US Protestantism. There's a very exclusionary and individual focus on salvation and being filled with the Holy Spirit and all of these ideas. Within American Protestantism, within American evangelicalism, there is a circle drawn, and only these people can experience that and no one else can. So I do love that Professor Haldeman draws the analogy here that people can experience this emptying and being filled without coming at it from the same perspective as him, which I think is really, really important to acknowledge that universality of the experience. The next thing he talks about is permeability. There's an obvious permeability that comes with gay male sex, right? There's an obvious permeability that happens physically, but also there is a stigmatism and a label that becomes attached to someone who not only has gay male sex, but enjoys being the receptive partner. People all the time will label that as it's very transgressive to patriarchy, it's effeminate, it's wrong, it's dirty. And Professor Haldeman says that in the process of transgressing taboos, the act of sodomy encourages him to reconsider the labels that he pastes upon other people, especially when those labels deny freedom to another person to be truly themselves. So he's saying basically in having this experience that puts on this label of sodomite to him, which is a misnomer of a term, but that's a whole nother research project. But in experiencing this act of sodomy, he is understanding the permeability of identity. He is finding solidarity with others and realizing the ways in which labels minimize and deny agency to people. So that's a really powerful revelation as well. The final revelation that I want to talk about that Professor Haldeman brings to light from his experience comparing the acts of being a receptive partner and theology is he talks about a posture of vulnerability. So physically, obviously, when he's engaging in this sort of if we want to call it being a bottom, right, that's supposed to be a posture of more vulnerability. Although in sex-positive culture, people have reclaimed that idea of bottoming and giving people who are bottoming more agency and not just assuming they're passive, right? But in this, he is saying, right, I'm assuming a posture of vulnerability. And he brings out a quote from Ron Grimes that I found really, really pertinent. Because what Dr. Haldeman is saying is that as he experiences a posture of vulnerability, he is simultaneously realizing what Ron Grimes would term liturgical supinity. What that means is that, like, liturgical meaning, like, as an act of worship, there are forms of worship and ritualization that arise from the ground and from human need, as opposed to those which are imposed, as it were, from the sky in an unquestionable God. And so what Professor Haldeman is saying via the words of Ron Grimes is that as he's engaging in a posture of vulnerability, he's experiencing a very human, horizontal practice of spiritual engagement with this sex act. But he's also recognizing that there is a place for liturgical supinity. So human-based visceral activities that function as an act of worship. And sometimes those lie within the church, and sometimes those lie outside of the church. Sometimes there is a human need that just draws someone to literally just need to, like, lay on the ground in silence and meditate, right? And that becomes a form of worship, of liturgical supinity, because this need for connection with divinity coincides with this human need. So it's not like there's an arbitrary thing that's being said, like, you must go do this, this, and this to experience God. It's like human need is meeting with divinity in this supine liturgical practice. I could go on for all day because I thought that was really interesting, but alas, I have more things to cover. So those were the four kind of ways in which receptivity brought about revelation for Professor Haldeman, in terms of, you know, his physical sexuality and a connection intellectually with divinity there. So the other article that Professor Haldeman wrote, which I found to be really, really fascinating, was it's called A Queer Fidelity, Reinventing Christian Marriage. Now, the queer fidelity concept really interests me because about 12 years ago, I came out. And coming out was this thing that was non-negotiable for me. I was raised in such a cisgendered, heterosexual, evangelical family that I actually thought I was a cisgendered female who was called to celibacy, which turns out not called to celibacy, also not a cisgendered female, also not a cisgendered male, to be honest. I am a non-binary person and I experience life through that lens. But once you realize that you are something that you're told by your tradition you cannot be, that's disorienting, because you have to strip down your religious beliefs strip it down to the studs and figure out what you believe versus what you were taught, and then figure out what your non-negotiables are. So for me, I was taught that I was a straight person and that heterosexual monogamy was the only way to function. So I've had to build back up my understanding once I understood myself to be queer. Then I had to ask myself if I understood myself to be monogamous, because monogamy is not implicit in the biblical text. So, you know, I worked around to the idea that I identify as monogamous. I do feel monogamous, but I don't think that it's a moral mandate to be monogamous. And that's why I appreciated this article by Professor Haldeman, because he brings up the idea that the church needs to reevaluate the parameters that the church, not God or the Bible, the institution of the church has placed on marriage. So basically what he's saying is the church as an institution has placed this idea on marriage, but it doesn't actually serve the body. It doesn't serve the people. So perhaps we need to revisit the idea of what fidelity means. So Dr. Haldeman grounds this realization and discussion about biblical marriage. He connects it to the historical church by quoting the words of Martin Luther at length, which I found to be very interesting. So this is the words of Martin Luther as quoted by Scott Haldeman in the Queer Fidelity article. Martin Luther said, "How I dread preaching on the estate of marriage. I am reluctant to do it because I am afraid if I once get really involved in the subject, it will make a lot of work for me and for others. The shameful confusion wrought by the accursed papal law occasioned so much distress, and the lax authority of both the spiritual and temporal swords has given rise to so many dreadful abuses and false situations, that I would much rather prefer to look into the matter. I would much rather prefer not to look into the matter or hear of it. But timidity is no help in an emergency. I must proceed. I must try to instruct poor bewildered consciences and take up the matter boldly." So what Martin Luther is saying is, like, just the way that the papal law was structured and the way the church was structured had completely manipulated and distorted the idea of marriage. And I think that we find ourselves in this same place, albeit hundreds of years separated from Martin Luther. We come to a place where specifically American evangelicalism has really purported these ideas of biblical marriage and biblical family values, but these are actually a creation of evangelicalism. They're not innate to the Bible. If you talk about the idea of biblical marriage, there is not one. I mean, there's man and man, there's man, woman, and woman. There's man, woman, concubine, slave. And if you want to get really wild, there's man, 700 wives and 300 concubines, So there's not one picture of biblical marriage. So the word that Dr. Haldeman brings up in this is, what is a Christian marriage if it's not defined by these parameters that are set out? What is the key there that really makes something a sacred union? And he posits the idea that it's the idea of fidelity. Dr. Haldeman proposes that in the face of ecclesiastical and social evolution, the rigid guidelines around marriage must be reevaluated. It would be his assertion that fidelity be placed at the center of the issue, as opposed to rigid social arrangements that are contained by a family unit and centered around sex. So he's saying that the sex and the idea of the biblical family and biblical marriage don't actually solve or answer any real questions about what matters in a relationship. So he mentions that the idea of fidelity may better serve a marker as relationship than church and legal boundaries, because it is actually more crucial. It's not an arbitrary thing, right? And it would be his assertion that, or he defines fidelity as not a repression of desire to maintain security, which is kind of what a lot of people find themselves in now, is they have to repress certain desires so that they can maintain emotional, religious, and economic security. But rather, he defines fidelity as a constant, honest communication in the midst of growth, change, and difference. And if I'm being honest, that's the first thing I've heard in my 12-year-long quest to really sort of re-understand the theology of what a spiritually grounded relationship would be. It's not a piece of paper by a government. It's not a piece of paper by a church. It's not an arbitrary mold that you're supposed to fit into. But fidelity is a constant, honest communication in the midst of growth, change, and difference. And I think, if I'm being honest, that's what I would hope for from any partner. And it's those things, that constant, honest communication, that end up fostering the most growth in me, and end up allowing me to support another the most fully, and also make me feel a spiritual connection, right, to my relationship. So I think that the idea of Christian marriage and Christian family values have just been so distorted by what American evangelicalism wants to portray them as. And not only has American evangelicalism portrayed them for here, they've colonized American evangelicals have colonized this idea of biblical marriage and biblical family to other people and places. So not only has it been distorted here, but it's been distorted en masse across the airwaves wherever American evangelicals find their voices welcomed, right? And so I think that it creates a lot of, like Martin Luther was saying, it creates a lot of dreadful abuses and false situations. You see, how many times have we seen church leaders who, their relationship broke up because, like, the male, pastor figure was, having sexual relationships with a younger male, or having extramarital affairs, or X, Y, and Z. And this goes across denomination. The artificial institutions that people have imposed upon marriage aren't working. The marriage rate in the church is equal to the marriage rate outside of the church. So there's something that's missing from the conversation about marriage. And I think the idea of a queer fidelity, meaning a fidelity without boundaries, a fidelity that defies binarization, I think that might be the thing that recenters the topic about what would make a meaningful relationship. So both of these articles were really really, really great and challenging to think about. And I think that's why I value them, because they bring my own understanding of my queerness into conversation with my theology, which is what I'm all about as a queer theologian. And I really appreciated both of these articles. I look forward to hearing what everybody got from them. And I look forward to hearing, from my classmates, but also look forward to hearing from people who hear this via conversations. I'm all about conversation, which by definition must to some extent occur spontaneously. So let me hear your spontaneous thoughts on the matter. As always, you can hit me up on Facebook. You can check out Conversations Official on Facebook, Conversations Official on Instagram. You can find me on TikTok at Spiritually NB LeoWT, where I'm serving you 60 seconds of theology and sass on the regular. And you can find Conversations Official on YouTube and Apple and Spotify and wherever you get podcasts. Thank you so much for joining me, folks. I have a great day, and I'll see you at the next conversation.